Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Klein.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Wray, thank you for being here. Since we last spoke in appropriations on April 27th, Special Counsel John Durham delivered his report detailing intelligence activities and investigations arising out of the 2016 presidential campaign. When Mr. Durham presented here at the committee, I asked him these questions. He was able to answer me in yes or no answers. I'd ask you to do the same. Did the FBI have an adequate basis on which to launch Crossfire Hurricane?
My understanding is that Mr. Durham found that it did not have a proper basis to elevate it to a full investigation, but that he thought it was an assessment or a preliminary inquiry was appropriate.
Did the FBI fail to examine all available exculpatory evidence?
I think, well, do you say to examine it? Certainly, I think there were failures, significant failures, with respect to exculpatory information.
Did the FBI interview all key witnesses in Crossfire Hurricane?
I think Mr. Durham, found that they did not.
Did the FBI abuse its authority under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act?
Well, certainly there were violations that were totally unacceptable and, in my view, cannot be allowed to happen again.
As noted in the report, Crossfire Hurricane investigators had hoped the returns on the Carter Page FISA application would, quote, self-corroborate. Do FBI or DOJ guidelines permit investigators to submit uncorroborated allegations in a FISA application in the hopes that the returns will self-corroborate?
I've never heard of that concept.
Okay. Is Crossfire Hurricane the only time the FBI has violated the procedures for the FISA process?
Well, there are a lot of different procedures, but that's certainly not the only compliance incidents that we've had with respect to FISA.
Director, as I expressed to you upstairs, the American people are outraged, and just this week I had at a town hall constituents expressing outrage about the actions of those within your agency who have damaged the FBI's reputation and undermined the good work of the vast majority of hardworking men and women within your agency. But going down the list, you have the Biden family investigations, you have the anti-Catholic memo. By the way, you mentioned 5 individuals who contributed to the anti-Catholic memo in the Richmond field office. Are they still employed by the FBI?
I don't think I mentioned any specific individuals. I did say that this was a product by a single field office that we took action on immediately, and we have an inspection that's underway right now that's looking at how this happened and how we make sure it doesn't happen again.
So it's still possible that individuals will be fired as a result of your review?
Well, I don't want to predetermine or forecast where the review will go. We're going to look at everything from exactly how it happened and what went wrong, and then if there are appropriate steps to be taken, we will take whatever the appropriate steps are.
Okay. You have the violence against pro-life clinics. You have the investigation of parents speaking at school board meetings. You have the collusion with big tech. The FISA abuses of Section 702 is where I want to focus right now. As you know, Section 702 authorizes warrantless surveillance. It's supposed to be targeted toward foreigners abroad, but the surveillance sweeps in a large amount of Americans' communications, and the FBI routinely runs searches of Section 702 data looking for phone calls, emails, text messages of Americans, so-called backdoor searches. Depending on the year, FBI has conducted anywhere from 3.4 million in 2021 to 200,000 in 2022. Given this fact, do you honestly think it's fair to continue describing Section 702 as an authority targeted only at foreigners abroad?
I do.
It looks like a framework that enables the FBI to spy on countless Americans. Would you agree with that assessment?
Well, I can't speak to what it looks like to certain people. I can tell you that it is an authority focused on foreigners overseas in the context of national security investigations. I would add to that the FBI's piece of that, the FBI only accesses. So everything we're talking about FBI related only goes to about 3% of the entire 702 collection. And then within that 3%, this is important.
Okay, I have 30
It's important that people
so.
understand this. The FBI ends up only accessing content in like 1.5% of that. So
I
a
understand.
little context is appropriate.
Well, if you're conducting hundreds of thousands or even just hundreds of warrantless searches of Section 702 data for Americans' communications, it's clearly a domestic surveillance tool. And I would argue that I believe it does pose a real problem within the FBI's conduct toward Americans and and I speak for many when I say I think it poses a real problem for the reauthorization of FISA authority for your organization. So with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Director Wray, for being here. I am troubled by many of the statements and questions we've heard today that embrace conspiracy theories and disinformation. And with these comments, it appears that some of my colleagues are trying to sow division and score political points rather than conduct legitimate oversight of the actual actions and policies of the FBI. I, like many Americans, would rather Congress focus on doing the people's business and ensuring that the FBI is able to do its job and do it well within the bounds of our Constitution and laws. Now, one of the most serious issues facing American communities now is drug abuse, particularly opioids and fentanyl. And in your opening remarks, you mentioned the arrest of 31 U.S. citizens in Northeast Ohio just a couple weeks ago, most hailing from Marion, for drug trafficking. Can you just take a minute, because I have some other questions, to describe what the FBI is doing to end the scourge of fentanyl and what additional tools you might need from Congress?
So the FBI is attacking the scourge of fentanyl coming from the southwest border in particular in a variety of ways. One, we are using our organized crime task forces to target the supply, the cartels in particular. Two, we're using our Safe Streets task forces to go after the gangs that are principally responsible, violent gangs, for distributing a lot of this all over our streets. Third, we're targeting provider abuse, prescription, pill mills and things like that through our healthcare fraud authorities. Fourth, we have something called J-Code, which focuses on the trafficking of fentanyl on the dark web, which is a real problem, and we've had a number of very significant takedowns there. We're also doing things like engaging in outreach, raising awareness. We put out a video called Chasing the Dragon with DEA that has been showed at a lot of schools around the country. We're trying to work with the health community. So there's a lot of things that we're doing, but this is it's an epidemic. Mm-hmm. I don't think that's an overstatement, and it's something that requires all hands on deck.
Okay, and if there are things you think Congress can help you with, please submit that to us afterwards. Another major threat to our nation is domestic terrorism, and that's something you've spoken about repeatedly. Like many Americans, I find it unpatriotic and dangerous when members of Congress embrace dangerous conspiracy theories that undermine our federal law enforcement and ultimately our democracy. And I find it disingenuous for members of Congress to harangue the head of the FBI about people losing faith in the FBI when those same members have been trumpeting lies and conspiracy theories about the agency for months. Words matter. They have consequences. And when leaders lie or embrace disinformation, that's dangerous. In recent years, we've seen increasing threats and violence levied against public servants at all levels, including journalists, elected officials, election workers, doctors, nurses, school officials, teachers, librarians, and more. And what these public servants have in common is they became targets for threats and violence when they had the guts to stand up to lies and conspiracy theories promulgated by the former president and his allies. We've seen MAGA extremists, Fox News pundits, Russian internet trolls, and elected officials parrot conspiracy theories and use heated language to convince the American public without facts that dedicated public servants are dangerous enemies who should be feared. Most Americans understand that this is not legitimate political discourse, and that this kind of overheated and fact-free rhetoric can in fact encourage political violence. It's not normal, and it should not be part of American public life. So, Director Wray, you've repeatedly testified about the serious threat that domestic violence extremists present to Americans. And these are people who commit violent and criminal acts in furtherance of social or political goals, whether racial and ethnic motivation or anti-government motivation. Can you talk about the role that mistrust in government and disinformation and conspiracy theories play in the radicalization and recruitment of extremists?
Well, certainly there's a whole host of misconceptions that are out there about any number of institutions, whether it's law enforcement, whether it's the Supreme Court, or whether it's any number of other institutions, that in the environment that we're in, where there are people who increasingly channel their rage into violence, that causes a problem. You know, there is a right way under the First Amendment to express what you're angry about and who you're angry with, and we take that very seriously and view as part of our mission, not just to protect the American people, but to uphold the Constitution. But when those views are then turned into violence and threats of violence, then we got a problem, and then I think the FBI has to act.
Thank you. I see my time has expired, but I would seek unanimous consent to introduce into the record a press release from the U.S. Attorney's Office of the Northern District of Ohio entitled 31 Individuals Involved in a Drug Trafficking Organization in Marion County and Lorain County Indicted.
Without objection, Chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Thank you. Mr. Director, when we abandoned Afghanistan, we released about 5,000 terrorists from the Parowan detention facility. One of those terrorists showed up at Abbey Gate 10 days later and killed 13 U.S. Marines. Where are the other 5,000?
I don't know that I can tell you where all 5,000
Well,
of
let
them
me
are.
put it more simply. Have you encountered any here in the United States?
We have quite a few ongoing investigations into foreign terrorist-related subjects, whether they're Al-Qaeda related or ISIS related, that we're conducting as you and I are having this conversation, and certainly.
So have you encountered any from Parowan here in the United States?
Specifically, I'm not sure I can say that. Let me follow up and make sure if there's anything more I can provide you on that.
Well, meanwhile, we've had about 1.5 million known gotaways cross the border as this crisis has unfolded. Any estimate of how many of those 5,000 among the 1.5 million known gotaways may be terrorists?
I know that we have seen an uptick, which is obviously concerning to me, and I can tell from your question, concerning to you, in KSTs, as we call them, known or suspected terrorists coming across the southwest border. And our folks are working very hard to try to do our part to try to keep tabs on those individuals.
Speaking of upticks, have we seen an uptick in criminal cartel or cartel-related gang activity in the United States over the last several years?
Yes, the cartels working in kind of an unholy alliance with dangerous violent gangs here in the U.S. are responsible not just for the abominable distribution of fentanyl all over the country, but also an awful lot of the violence that comes along with it.
And that's coming principally across our southern border?
That's a huge driver of it, certainly.
Huge driver. It's reported we've lost contact with the guardians of more than 85,000 unaccompanied minors who've been brought here by the cartels through the southern border. How many of these children are still unaccounted for?
That I'm not sure. We have the answer to that. That may be a question for DHS.
What's the Woods procedure?
The Woods procedure is a procedure has nothing to do with 702. It has to do with traditional FISA, Title I FISA as we call it, and involves having files that have all the underlying documents to support each of the factual assertions.
Is that important to the integrity of FISA applications?
Yes, sir.
In February 2020, you assured the committee that you took these FISA abuses seriously, that you were working to address them. A year and a half later, the Office of the Inspector General reported that you weren't. They reported systemic noncompliance and essentially that some FBI field personnel took the Woods procedure as a joke. If we can't trust your past reforms, how seriously should we take your promises of future reform?
I appreciate the opportunity to address this one. So that OIG finding actually applies to, number one, that applies to compliance problems that occurred before all the fixes that I was testifying to you all about. Even though the report came out later, it was covering a time period that predated all of the fixes and reforms we put in place.
Your general counsel assured Mr. Durham that the abuses would not have happened because of the new procedures for supervisorial review, yet some of the worst abuses in Crossfire Hurricane were committed by supervisory agents. So why should we have any great confidence that's not going to happen again?
There are a couple different sets of reforms here. So the first is on the reforms that we put in place in response to the Inspector General's crossfire hurricane report.
But we can't trust your supervisors is the problem. The problem seems to be that this power exists at all, and human beings, being what they are, will tend to abuse them. Could you describe the term parallel construction as it relates to evidence produced in FISA searches?
Parallel construction? I'm not sure I've used that.
Doesn't that refer to the FBI using forbidden information from a 702 search to alert local law enforcement to search for and then produce the same material without revealing that it came from an improper search?
I'm just not sure about the use of the term.
Well, has the FBI ever employed that particular tactic in prosecuting American citizens?
Not to my knowledge, but again, I can look into that and get back to you.
What percentage of FISA warrant applications are rejected by the FISA court?
I don't know that we have that number. There's usually a back and forth with the court. It's not unusual for the court to...
It's a fraction of percentage, isn't it?
A fraction of a percentage?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if that's right, but it's definitely a small number. And I think that's partly because our folks learn over time what the court expects.
Which makes that sound an awful lot like a rubber stamp. I see my time's expired. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman. Good afternoon, Director Wray. Thank you for coming before the Judiciary Committee this afternoon, and I have read your testimony. I want to redirect this questioning for a moment, and I want to focus on the important work that the FBI is tasked with when it continues to do its work with gun violence prevention and keeping our communities safe. As of today, there have been over 300 mass shootings. That's more than the number of days that we have in this year. And statistics will continue to show us over and over again that during the summer, these numbers continue to rise. Extreme risk protection orders play an important role in law enforcement's response to preventing mass shootings from happening. And what are also known as red flag laws or orders, they empower law enforcement, along with family members and household members, to petition a court to actually have an individual that appears to be in crisis have those firearms just temporarily taken away or removed from them with a court order to be returned during expiration of that order. I have a few questions for you, so if you can answer as directly as you can, I appreciate it. Family members and members of law enforcement can often identify individuals who would pose a risk to themselves or to others within the community when they actually possess a gun. As the head of the United States Federal Law Enforcement Agency, do you believe that these red flag laws and these programs enhance public safety?
I don't want to speak on behalf of any specific legislative proposal, but I will say that I know from experience that a number of states have had good experiences with those laws.
Thank you. And in the past several years, several states have actually enacted those extreme risk protection orders. In total, we actually have 21 states, and the District of Columbia have enacted their own forms of red flag laws. If a person who is subject to such an order tries to buy a gun from a federally licensed firearm dealer, would the FBI approve or deny the sale?
Well, I believe if the order is required by state law, making it a state prohibitor, and therefore is loaded into the NICS system, then when the background check is run, when the FFL, the Federal Firearms Licensee, contacts NICS to proceed with the sale, that would pick up the so-called the order that you're talking about, and if that's a prohibitor, then that would block the transaction, is my understanding.
So in the absence of an application or applicable state law, is there a way for the FBI agent to seek an order under federal law?
I'm not aware of any federal law to that effect.
Exactly. If an FBI agent has information that someone has been violent many times in the past, but is not able to seek a criminal conviction, is there a way for the FBI to deny the sale of a gun to that person?
We only deny sales for people who are prohibited by law from possessing firearms.
My bill, the Federal Extreme Risk Protection Order Act, which was passed by the House last Congress, would provide Americans in all states access to these truly life-saving measures. I have reintroduced this bill again this term. Last summer, Congress also passed the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. Among other critical gun violence provisions in that, the legislation begins to address the problem of gun trafficking. What steps has the FBI taken to implement or utilize this new law that actually helps to stop gun trafficking?
Well, we're of course working closely with the Justice Department to implement all the provisions of the law that relate to NICS in particular. The place has had the biggest impact on us is certainly on the additional checks that now would be run for the 18 to 20-year-olds. And we started implementing that last October. It was fully implemented starting in January. And it's a big change for us and for the state agencies that are on the receiving end of the request for information, as well as for the FFLs, both the big stores and the mom and pops. It's a big change in the system. I think we've done about 100,000 or so checks of this 18 to 20, in other words, U21 group that we're talking about since the implementation of the act. Those are not all denials, to be clear. In fact, the vast majority of them were sales that appropriately proceeded. But there were some that were, of course, denials based on the statute.
Thank you so much. I'm out of time.